I will never understand what happened that made violence genuinely more palatable for the masses than anything that might be slightly erotic, especially when it comes to the horror genre. I will never understand how the murder part of horror is more understated and acceptable than any type of sexual horror. I myself am a victim of sexual assault. I have lived sexual horror. And I will never understand then why physical violence is treated in this better, cleaner, more pure category than sexual violence, because in my mind, they live in the same pocket, which is violence. And then when they are portrayed in fiction, especially horror fiction, they live in the same spot to me, which is the horror spot. They aren't separate and they aren't special. There's nothing about sex that is inherently more evil than violence. In fact, I would argue violence is always worse than sex. And sexual violence is not othered from violence in my mind, that's just violence. The reason I bring this up is because, once again, there is discourse online about the Coffin of Andy and Leyley for the millionth time. Before you ask, yes, I've played the game in full, multiple routes, and it will always shock me that people have such a strong dislike for this horror game that is obviously horror. This horror game full of murder and cannibalism and emotional abuse and parental neglect. This story that is a very obvious metaphor for toxic and abusive relationships, especially in regards to the cult and the demon that are in the story. It will always shock me that all of that stuff apparently means nothing, because the game also happens to have incest in it. Optional incest, mind you. The concept and the inclusion of this incest in this game has made people go wild. They have run the creator off the internet after doxing her and abusing her and sending a bomb threat to her place of living. They have made her wipe her entire game catalog off the internet and sell her IP of Coffin of Andy and Leyley just to preserve her safety, because people online were so caught up in the idea that her game includes optional incest. And the reason this shocks me is because incest is in media all of the time, like all of the time. And this is a horror game, and the incest is a part of the horror, so it's scary, so it shocks me. It shocks me people are so upset about this, especially when incest is included in all types of media, not just horror. I mean, hello, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon is on right now, and every single couple in House of the Dragon is an incestuous couple. And it's not being condemned or anything. It's not like every single time that the siblings in Game of Thrones have sex, they turn to the camera and say, this is wrong. You know what I mean? Incest is something that happens in fiction all of the time, especially horror fiction. Let us point at the classics. The original Hannibal / Silence of the Lambs / Red Dragon book series, the actual Hannibal Lecter books, where Hannibal's whole motivation is his incestuous relationship with his aunt. That's the whole book. That's the whole thing. That's the whole series. Let's look at things like The Hills Have Eyes. Let's look at all the classic horror like Psycho. Let's go all the way back. All the horror movies you can think of. And let's go back to then all the thrillers too, like Cruel Intentions. Incest has always been present in fiction. I don't understand what has made people hyper-focus on the incest in Coffin of Andy and Leyley, especially when the actual violence and the horror and the slasher aspects of the game seem to not cause anyone to have a moral panic. It is quite literally just the incest, which once again, incest has been in media forever. There is something about the United States Puritan movement that has made violence palatable, that has made us numb to things such as violence on our TVs, violence on our streets, violence in real life, but so upset at the idea of anyone exploring eroticism or perversion in any form of media at all, and that showing it must endorse it, and that there are no lines. But why is this game getting the brunt of it? Why aren't there people standing outside of George R. R. Martin's house protesting? Why is no one, calling the networks that air Game of Thrones? Well, in my opinion, it's because the creator of Coffin of Andy and Leyley was an accessible person to bully. They were queer, they were online, and they were an independent artist. And this made them an easy target for the Puritan mob to attack and attack and attack, and to enact and threaten the violence that seems to not faze them. If you play an entire horror game and you come out of it saying, ew, the siblings were icky, then I feel like perhaps you weren't smart enough about the horror genre to engage with the game in the first place. It's a fictional game. It's a horror game. And again, if you genuinely sit here saying that dark eroticism of any form is inherently worse than cannibalism, then I do have questions for you. A lot of them.